Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Silverchair Universe Presents Yewno. My name is Stephanie Lovegrove. I'm the marketing manager here at Silverchair. We're excited to have you with us for the first of these webinars to learn more about Yewno. We have with us Ruth Pickering, who will be taking us through Yewno's offerings. And just a couple of housekeeping things on my end before I hand it over to her. You've all been muted, so if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we will have a period at the end of the presentation to answer questions. The webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards. And also, as soon as the webinar ends, you'll be sent a survey. If you could take a few minutes to complete that, it'll help us just to continuously improve both the Universe offerings as well as these webinars themselves. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ruth.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So what I'd like to do is share my screen.
Okay.
Great. So hopefully everybody can see, can everybody now see a PowerPoint?
I cannot, Ruth.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Perfect. Great. So what I'd like to do is take you through a couple of slides and then show you a live demo of our product Yewno Discover. So in terms of the background, I'd like to explain where the technology comes from, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the existing ecosystem and where we see the product being used and how it fits. Then I'd like to explain how our technology works, because it's very new. And then I'd like to take you through the existing content set that we include. And then I'll go straight into a demo. As Stephanie mentioned, there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. And do also please feel free to email in any questions as we go along. Okay, so we'll work on that as well. So first of all, looking at the background to this. So Yewno was actually launched, the company was created in 2014, but the background goes way back to 2009, when our CEO was studying at King's College London for a PhD in applied mathematics, specifically in the field of econophysics. So econophysics is a discipline that looks at explaining economic and financial cycles using unstructured mathematics derived from physics. And so the initial part of his research, based in London, working with the financial community, was using huge volumes of unstructured text to see if they could explain financial cycles. When that was successful, they wanted to test the technology in another domain of information. Again, complex systems, but this time in life sciences. So between 2010 and 2013, they tested it in the area of biomedical research. So at that time, the CEO was CEO of a small pharma company in Switzerland. And what the company was specifically trying to do was to find cures for rare diseases. So all of the big drug money goes on things like cancer that affect a huge percentage of people. But for somebody with rare diseases, obviously you still look to find a cure, but you won't have anything like the available resources for the more major diseases. So what they were trying to do was to see if they could identify potential cures, potential mechanisms of action using existing drugs. So they ingested 23 million records from publications that were relevant and built what they called an inference engine. And the idea was to see if they could create inferences and understand potential cures. And within 18 months, they'd found 312 potential mechanisms of action. So in the previous 10 years of the company had been in existence, they had 10 drugs that were somewhere in the pharmaceutical pipeline. So this use of AI had really turbocharged the speed at which they could come up with potential remedies. On the board of that company was Professor Michael Keller, who is the vice provost and university librarian at Stanford. And he saw what had happened, and he'd been on the board before this AI had been implemented. And he said, I think this technology is not life science specific, I think it's interdisciplinary. And he invited the CEO to come to Stanford to finish his PhD there and to build an interdisciplinary research tool for the Stanford community. So at that point, he relocated to the West Coast and built what was called at the time Harry. Harry stood for the hyperassociation of related inferences, and it was an inference engine, which means that it was recreating a neural network model in the same way that your brain works. And it was about finding connections between concepts rather than keywords. And when that first pilot with Stanford was successful, Yewno was founded, and one of our first products I'm going to show you today, Yewno Discover, which is targeted at the academic environment. So in terms of Yewno Discover, really what's the opportunity and why is it different? So in the market today, there are a number of search tools. There are a range of public tools that are free for use, and there are a range of library-specific products. And search is great when you know what you're looking for. So if you know a specific author, a title, a book, you'll probably find what you're looking for really, really quickly. But what about if you don't know exactly what you're looking for? What if you go to a lecture on quantum field theory and someone tells you to write an essay and you really don't even know where to start? You don't know who the correct publishers are, you don't know the best databases, you don't know the best websites. And what if you're trying to understand something where you really don't have any context or perspective? So that's really the space we see ourselves in, which is what I would call true discovery, where you are really looking to understand and learn, and you don't have a specific source in mind when you start your research. So in terms of how we create the product and why it's so very different, our technology reads full text. So we ingest the full text of any high quality academic and scholarly source. It could be journals, it could be books, sometimes clinical trial information, it can be high quality news. We don't scrape the internet and we don't ingest blogs. So it has to fall into that high quality academic and scholarly domain. But the key thing is our algorithms are reading the full text of every single item. So we're not relying on the existing metadata for our search results. And as the algorithms are reading the literature, they're using this neural network model that I mentioned earlier. So they're identifying meaning in the form of concepts, and then they're knitting that together into a huge graph network. And what I've tried to show on the right-hand side is how a graph network is similar to how your brain works. So as you're reading any item of content on a daily basis, whether it's a news article, whether it's a journal article or a book chapter, what your brain will be doing is extracting all of the things that are interesting and pertinent to you. And some of those will relate to your existing knowledge base, and some of those will be new things. And your brain will be creating all of those new connections or inferences. So very specifically in terms of what we use computational semantics, graph theory, and machine learning to really create this environment. In terms of the content that's already discoverable, we've got over 130 million items. And because it's a big data machine, we needed to start off with some high volume sources, but we're really interested in including all the kinds of sources that our customers would like to see. And our customers are in 7 countries now. We have customers in the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Australia. And they range from research institutions, teaching institutions, state institutions, private institutions, so really across the full spectrum. And from our perspective, because it's a big data technology, the more content, the better it will get. So today there are 130 million items, one day we'll have 1 billion items, and so on and so forth. And as we have more and more, the results will continue to improve. So what I'd like to do now is to move into a demo. So I'm going to go back and try and share a different screen with you. Sorry, I'm just trying to swap and share a different screen, but it's not letting me. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see in front of them a search bar and a pale grey screen. Stephanie, do tell me if that's not what you guys are seeing.
Yes, no, that's what we see. Thank you.
Fantastic. So this is what the product looks like. So what you would do, the user would start typing here. So I'll start typing in. And as I type in, I can't actually spell today, so there we go. I'm looking for developmental robotics. So as I type in, options start appearing. The option, the search result, is accompanied by a little bit of text, the topic and the subtopic there, and then the user can select, and I'm going to select the first one. So as you'll see, the main part of the product is on the right hand side of the screen. It's this graph visualization. So I searched for developmental robotics, and what I get at a glance is developmental robotics and all the related concepts to that. And I can scroll around the screen and I can have a look at each one, and you'll see as I hover on each concept that's related, these yellow lines appear, and these are secondary connections. So I can understand that developmental robotics is connected to recapitulation theory. Recapitulation theory is also connected to philosophy of mind, etc. And I can scroll around and see what I'm interested in. And anything that I'm interested in, so I come here to artificial intelligence, and if I'm interested in that, I can click on that to understand more. And the most important thing about the product is that everything you see is interactive. So if you look at any of these concepts, they can be clicked on to understand more about them. Also, if I was interested in the connection between any two items, that can also be clicked on. I'll come back to the graph in a minute. And on the left-hand side, we always have the information panel. So first of all, for any concept that the user searches, they'll be given an overview. And an overview will come from a reference source, and it will be a definition of that concept search term. Then they'll see a list of all of the concepts. So the list here is the same as the list that you will see around the search on the right, but sometimes people prefer to read a list. And then we have the documents. And here we have all of the documents that are relevant to the search. And if somebody's interested in it, they could click into any item, and then they'll see a snippet of information. And if they want, they can click back to the publisher there. And now let's go back to the graph. So if, for example, I decide I'm interested in artificial intelligence, I can click on that. And then what will happen in the left-hand panel, that will be updated with the information on artificial intelligence. So as before, first of all, I get a definition. And if there's more than one definition available, that will all be shown, and then the user can select the source that they prefer. Then, again, we have the concept list, as before. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is a bit slow, so it's not coming up yet, but it will. And then we get the document list. And again, the user, if they're interested in any of the documents, they can immediately click into them and get to a snippet of information, and then click through to the publisher site or click through their library database if they're a subscriber. And if I decide I'm really interested in artificial intelligence, I can also click here on expand concept, and artificial intelligence will be added in to my graph. So I started with developmental robotics, I've added in artificial intelligence, and you can see them both. I'll just make that a bit smaller so we can show the whole thing. And then the really interesting thing is what we have in the middle. So going back to what the technology is doing about creating connections, creating inferences. So we can see here the things that link developmental robotics and artificial intelligence are cognitive science, machine learning, deep learning, and so on and so forth. So you can hover over. Now, you may be wondering why some of the writing doesn't show up. So we will only show on the screen the amount of text that a user can read. So we'll never show overlapping text. So if we can't show all of the text, then you need to hover over, and then the text will appear. So now the user can see, oh, this is very interesting. These are the things that connect these two items. So anything that somebody sees, they can interrogate, they can click on to understand more about it, they can go to the next level of detail. The other thing you can do is you can hypothesize. So I could hypothesize, I could say, I'm interested to understand if there's a link to psychology. So I type psychology, and again, I get all these options, and I'm going to select the first one. So up comes psychology, and then I'm just waiting for the blue line at the top to complete, and then it will appear in the graph. So now we have psychology entered into our graph. So I'm just centering it again. So first of all, we had developmental robotics, then artificial intelligence, and now psychology. And so we can see these really interesting connections between all of them. Now, in some cases, you'll see this thick yellow line where there's a direct connection. And in some cases, you'll see a connection through another concept. So for example, here we see a connection through Jean Piaget. And if Jean Piaget is a concept that you're interested to understand more about, as before, you can click on that. And in the left-hand panel, the detail about Jean Piaget arrives, and we can read about who he was. So he was a Swiss psychologist the first scientist to make systematic studies of how children learn, also a 20th century pioneer in developmental psychology. And if this is an interesting angle for us in our research journey, we can click on that to expand the concept and he will be added into the graph. And you've probably got the sense now, but you can keep going and you can click, you can have up to 8 of these blue nodes in the graph at any one time. And so the user can visualize in front of them all of these concepts and their connections. They can also use some of the functionality in the right-hand panel to reconfigure the graph if they're interested to reconfigure it, showing different information. And equally, if they want to start a new search, you can just clear the graph and start your research in a completely different space. There's other functionality on the left-hand panel in terms of adding new concepts, exporting your research journey, and also adding notes and saving things. So all of the things you'd expect to see. What I'm going to do now is take you back to a couple of case studies. So hopefully you guys can now see again my demo screen. So looking on to some use cases. So one of the first uses we really see happening in universities is really helping students to develop research skills. I get a surprising number of people saying to me that undergraduates, when they get to university, actually don't necessarily know the best way to formulate search queries or the best place to go. So what we try to do with this product is we ingest content from all of the different publishers across all different domains of information. So you don't have to know a specific engineering database or humanities publisher, because if your query is relevant, whoever it's from, the information will surface. So it helps people who don't necessarily know where to go to. And it also gives people at a single glance an understanding of the perspective and the breadth of the topic that they're looking at. And then from that understanding, they can drill down into the areas that they're interested in. So many people use it in their teaching and instruction classes, and to help people at the beginning of their kind of assignments, their homework, to understand which angle they want to focus their research on. The other area we get a huge amount of usage in is around interdisciplinary research. So there are brilliant facilities for specific subjects, but it's quite difficult sometimes for students to carry out interdisciplinary research. And one of the reasons I do the developmental robotics and psychology demonstration is because I was asked that by an engineering student who went to the engineering library and had fantastic resources available, but they were all about engineering. And they were told by their dean that great discovery in the future would come from interdisciplinary discovery. So it's quite difficult in that situation to understand. Clearly you can't read everything, you can't go everywhere where you might look. So it's a brilliant tool if you want to hypothesize that there might be a link from a different area, and you can put in different concepts and you can see if there are in fact any relationships. So sometimes there aren't, and if, for example, there hadn't been any connections between developmental robotics and psychology, then you'd have just seen those two nodes appear on the screen and you'd have seen no lines linking them. But it's very, very useful in that space to help people who have a kind of inkling and intuition that things might be connected, and then they can actually follow that through. And the third angle is really about serendipitous discovery. So as I said at the beginning, search is brilliant if you know what you're looking for, but very often you'll put in a search query and you'll get a list of tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, or even millions of results. So what a researcher then needs to do is to narrow down. And as you narrow down on your search and as you become more specific, you can guarantee that you won't find anything that you're not looking for. And so what the product does is, because it's bringing you this visualization of related concepts, you will inadvertently discover things that you weren't necessarily looking for in the first place. And it brings back that serendipity into the discovery process. So in terms of how it really helps people learn and how it helps researchers find things, it's really about intuitively exploring. And the graph visualization is a much more intuitive way for people to gain knowledge and to gain understanding. It also helps, as I mentioned, around cross-disciplinary discovery and the discovery of things that you might think at first glance are totally unrelated and you wouldn't even dream of looking for. The other thing that people love about the products is that you can immediately get to the document. So the minute you find any kind of concept you're interested in the left-hand panel, you can quickly find relevant documents and link through to the full text. And from our perspective, the main thing really is going back to what the technology is doing and recreating that neural network model. It's really about helping people find connections that they didn't know existed and hunting for emergent knowledge. So that was my final slide. And what I'd like to do is hand back to Stephanie to open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat box. If there's anyone, anything else you guys would like to hear more about, please feel free to put that in now. It's wonderful to see that in action, Ruth. Thank you so much for doing the demo.
My pleasure. Yeah, I think it's kind of trying to explain a neural network model and graph visualization without showing it is quite a tricky thing.
I can imagine. Give it another minute. And while we're waiting to see if there are any follow-up questions, if you think of anything after the meeting that you have questions about, feel free to get in touch either directly with Ruth or with your PDM. And all right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Anything else you'd like to add, Ruth?
Well, one of the questions I often get asked by publishers is, how this works in terms of license holdings. So the way we work with universities who are our customers is that they give us their IP ranges and their link resolver holdings, so we know what their license content is. And if, for example, a researcher finds an article from a book or a journal that is licensed, there is a button at the top of the screen that says find it in my library, and then they would click on that and they would be immediately into the link resolver in exactly the same way as they would be with a traditional search query. If the library does not subscribe to that content, they are offered either a direct link back to the publisher or interlibrary loan. So there's never any risk that any content will be found that is actually not licensed by that institution.
Wonderful. We do have a question. Can you discuss the Yewno business model?
Yeah, so the way we work with publishers with this product is that we ingest the full text, and that can be delivered to us in many different ways. It could be FTP, it could be a disk. We can crawl if that's easier. And then we will send all of the traffic back to the publisher. So if it comes through the link resolver, that would come back in the traditional way from a library, or it can come back directly through the link that I showed you that comes straight back to whatever site you want us to send the traffic to. And that's a sort of zero cost relationship. So we don't charge you to ingest content, and equally we don't pay you for content, but you will get all of the traffic. And then to higher education institutions, so to universities or to high schools, or indeed to public libraries, actually, it's a subscription model. So they are paying us, but they're not paying us for content, they're paying us for the discovery interface. And then what we do is we enable access to whatever license holdings that they have. So yeah, if you were a university, let's say you had 5,000 FTE, there's a particular price point for that. If you had 50,000 FTE, so our subscription model is based on headcount.
Wonderful. And in case anyone's wondering, as far as what is the process for getting connected with Yewno via the Silverchair Universe, it is very simple process. It's basically opt-in, and we enable Yewno to scroll the content, and it just becomes a part of their program. So it's a very easy thing to get involved in. If you want to speak to your PDM or to Ruth about next steps, that is probably the best way to go. Any other questions while we're here? All right, well, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining us. We will have more monthly webinars coming, and as I said, this recording will be sent out to you shortly. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.